A promise of cattle, a dream of freedom. Whirlwinds spiraled across the arid land as Kiera groomed Estrella, the mare's coat gleaming beneath the sun's harsh glare. The aroma of equine musk and sun-cured hay clung to the air, usually a welcome constant, now felt suffocating. She fantasized about racing across the vast plains with Estrella, their forms a blur, a symphony of motion, unshackled from the endless obligations chaining her to the ranch. A life chosen by her, not dictated by her father's burdens. She stroked Estrella's silken neck. Someday, she breathed, we'll both be free. The thud of approaching hooves shattered her daydream. Javier, her father, dismounted, his expression a mix of weariness and resolve. A stern man, etched by years wrestling a merciless land, yet his eyes usually held a flicker of affection for Kiera. Today, that flicker was almost extinguished. Kiera, Mija, he began, his voice gravelly, fetch water, please. The heat is brutal. She nodded, sensing the gravity in his words. Something was deeply wrong. Approaching the house, a lavish buggy stood hitched near the porch, its polished surfaces reflecting the sun. Mr. Harding, the merchant from Harmony Creek, sat fanning himself with a broad hat. His fleshy face glistened with perspiration, and his eyes, typically shrewd and calculating, held an unusual gentleness. Suspicion pricked at her, but she dutifully filled a pitcher with cool well water and returned to the porch. As she neared, she overheard hushed voices, Javier's voice laced with supplication, Harding's voice silken and assured. The drought has been merciless. Harding, my debts. I am struggling. Javier's voice broke. Harding chuckled, a low rumble. Men in dire straits seek solutions, Javier, and I value ingenuity. Kiera froze, her heart hammering. She strained to listen. The herd, they would be invaluable. A fresh start. But the cost. Javier faltered. Harding's voice dripped like honey. The cost, my friend, is a daughter. A comely, capable daughter. A wife. A partner. The pitcher slipped from Kiera's nerveless fingers, shattering against the porch with a splash. Conversation ceased. Both men swiveled to face her, their faces a study in shock and discomfort. The world seemed a list. The sun, moments before a comforting presence, now felt like a leaden weight. The scent of hay and horses, once soothing, now suffocated her. Javier hurried to her, his face racked with remorse. Kiera, Mija. He couldn't force the words out. He avoided her gaze. Harding, ever the pragmatist, cleared his throat. An unfortunate incident, surely, but perhaps opportune. Kiera, my dear, your father and I have been discussing your future. He smiled, a saccharine expression that failed to reach his eyes. Kiera retreated, her gaze flitting between her father and the merchant. The grim truth bloomed in her stomach like poison. She was to be bartered, a possession, a means to survival. Her dreams of autonomy, of shaping her own future, lay in fragments like the broken pitcher. She looked at her father, silently begging him to refute it, to declare it a cruel jest. But his silence was his confession. He was willing to surrender her joy, her life, for the sake of his ranch, his pride. The affection she had always held for him cooled, replaced by a bitter chill of betrayal. Without a word, she pivoted and bolted, fleeing towards the stables, towards Estrella, towards the only sanctuary she knew. Tears blurred her vision as she ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to escape. The ranch, her father, Mr. Harding, all felt like a vice tightening around her. Reaching the stables, she threw herself onto Estrella's back, her sobs echoing in the stillness. The mare shifted, sensing her anguish. Kiera buried her face in Estrella's mane, the familiar scent offering meager solace. She had no plan, no destination, only an agonizing yearning for a life beyond the one just snatched from her. The dust devils seemed to taunt her, swirling vortexes of a freedom now impossibly distant. Dust, whispers, and a cowboy's resolve. The whiskey, raw and potent, blazed a trail down Jesse's parched throat, a fleeting reprieve from the omnipresent grit of redemption. Clinging to the air, dusting the scarred tables, even tainting the smile of the saloon girl. He brooded in the dimmest corner, his drink a shield against the murmur of voices. The saloon doors, perpetually in motion, sighed open and shut, each draft a reminder of dust devils and wild sage. Then their voices sliced through the haze. Javier, Kiera's father, affected hardiness, strained at the edges, and Harding, the corpulent merchant whose gaze remained unsettlingly fixed. Settled then, Harding? The herd in exchange for the girl. Though muted, Javier's question landed with icy precision. A sound like stones tumbling down a hillside served as Harding's laughter. The finest bloodline in the territory, Javier, and a wife to bear sturdy sons. A bargain well struck, I'd say. Jesse's grip tightened on his glass, threatening to shatter it. He should turn a blind eye, remain uninvolved. Yet the words, like poison, lingered in the air, a sentence delivered without appeal. He swallowed more whiskey, the taste now acrid and unwelcome. She's a decent girl, Harding, a hard worker. But this ain't her choice, you understand? Apology and a strange defiance tangled in Javier's tone. Choice? What use is choice to a woman? She'll obey, or face the consequences. Harding's response dripped with possessive malice. An image sparked in Jesse's mind. A girl, barely past childhood, her face smudged with grime and despair, begging for release. Not Kiera precisely. Lily, pawned off by her own family to settle debts incurred at the gambling table. Lily, whose haunted eyes still stalked his sleep. He had failed her. That memory, a searing brand on his soul, rekindled a familiar inferno. He'd been powerless to save Lily. That helplessness gnawed at him still, a phantom weight pressing on his chest. Arriving at the homestead, he'd found a bolted door and a silence that roared louder than any scream. By the time he forced entry, only the stale scent of cheap perfume and the echoing void of Lily's absence remained. The glass slammed onto the table, the sharp report momentarily silencing the saloon's drone. Heads swiveled in his direction, then quickly averted. Jesse Callahan was not a man to cross. He rose, the chair protesting against the rough-hewn floorboards. Javier and Harding, jolted, turned to face him. Jesse ignored them, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the smoky haze. He couldn't allow history to repeat itself. He simply wouldn't. He felt the familiar shift within, his resolve solidifying, the muted fury that had simmered beneath the surface finally erupting into full boil. The specters of the past pressed him onward, the memory of Lily's stolen future fueling his determination. He adjusted his hat's brim, jaw muscles flexing. He strode toward the saloon doors, each step measured, each footfall resonating in the abrupt quiet. The outside air, crisp and cool, carried the scent of pine from the distant peaks. He mounted his horse, the saddle leather groaning softly. He knew what he had to do. He had to ride. He had to locate Kiera, and he had to liberate her. Midnight rescue. The ranch dogs baying erupted even before Jesse neared the fence line. He pressed Diablo, his reliable paint horse, into a faster gait, the drum of hooves on parched ground joining the canine clamor. He'd gambled on a dark night to shroud his approach, but the dog was a snarling complication. Well away from the main house, he dismounted, tethering Diablo to a twisted mesquite. Dust hung heavy in the still air, laced with the heady perfume of night-blooming jasmine. He moved with the practiced stealth of a hunter, a skill honed by years of tracking and, more recently, evading notice. A soft glow bled from a rear window. Kiera's, he prayed. He tapped gently, their agreed-upon signal, then waited, his pulse a frantic tattoo. The dog's barking intensified, closer, more menacing, putting him on edge, prepared to shield Kiera above all else. The window grudgingly opened. Kiera's face, wan and etched with anxiety, appeared in the aperture. "Jesse, what are you doing? It's far too risky." Her voice, a fragile thread. "I'm here for you." Kiera, he murmured, his words sharpened with need. I heard about the arrangement. You don't have to go through with this transaction. He saw the internal struggle play across her features, a fleeting spark of hope, quickly smothered by dread. I can't. Papa needs the alliance. He's counting on the stock. Blast the cattle, Jesse retorted, his voice roughened. What about your own needs? Your dreams? She averted her gaze, her fingers twisting restlessly in her nightdress. What I desire is irrelevant. He reached out, his hand gently tilting her chin upward, forcing her to meet his eyes. A profound sadness swam in her wide, luminous gaze, a feeling that tore at his resolve. Not to me, Kiera. I refuse to watch you bartered away like property. A pilot light flared in her eyes, an ember of the spirit he knew was imprisoned within. But where would I go? How would I survive? Anywhere. Somehow. So long as it's your choice, not theirs. I'll stand by you. I promise. The dog was nearly upon him, its snarls ripping through the stillness. Time evaporated. I don't know what to do, she faltered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. Kiera, decide now. I can't linger here. He saw the resignation creep back into her eyes, the weary acceptance of a fate she didn't deserve. Then something shifted. A sudden determination steeled her expression. She took a shaky breath. Wait, she breathed, then vanished from the window. He froze, every sense heightened. The dog was imminent, teeth bared, eyes gleaming with malice. He instinctively reached for his revolver. When the back door hinges protested and Kiera materialized, a meager satchel clutched tightly. Let's go, she stated, her voice surprisingly firm. Hand in hand, they sprinted toward the mesquite where Diablo waited. The dog snapped at their heels, but Jesse lashed out, sending it yelping. He hoisted Kiera onto Diablo's back, then mounted behind her, gathering the reins. He cast one last glance at the ranch, at the house that had been both her prison and her sanctuary, a life she was now forsaking. He spurred Diablo into a gallop, the horse's hooves a thunderous beat against the land, carrying them away from everything Kiera had ever known into the vast, unknown expanse of the night. The barking receded, consumed by the wind's howl. The future remained hidden, but of one thing he was certain. He would dedicate himself to protecting Kiera and ensuring she never questioned her decision. The stars, previously veiled by the inky curtain of night, winked into existence, celestial beacons guiding their flight. Across the plains, the first day was a canvas of relentless blue sky and whispering grasses that stretched to a horizon Kiera couldn't fathom. Jesse rode ahead, a stoic figure against the vastness, his shoulders squared as if carrying the weight of the plains themselves. Kiera followed, perched uncomfortably on a borrowed saddle, the rhythmic creak of leather a constant counterpoint to the wind's song. Conversation was sparse, hesitant words tossed like stones into a deep well. Thank you, she ventured, the second time she'd offered the sentiment since leaving her home behind. For this. Jesse didn't turn. You don't need to thank me, Kiera. No one should be traded like property. The simplicity of his statement resonated, a stark contrast to the complex web of obligation and expectation she'd always known. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the changing angle of the sun and the growing ache in Kiera's muscles. As dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jesse finally called a halt near a sparse cluster of cottonwood trees. We'll camp here, he said, dismounting with an easy grace that Kiera envied. While Jesse tended to the horses, Kiera gathered fallen branches, her fingers clumsy at first, then gaining confidence as she mimicked his movements. He showed her how to build a fire pit, how to arrange the wood for optimal burning, his touch brief but grounding when he adjusted her hand. As the flames crackled to life, casting dancing shadows on their faces, a fragile sense of normalcy settled between them. Jesse produced strips of dried meat and hardtack from his saddlebags. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Kiera spoke. Why? She asked softly, her gaze fixed on the fire. Why did you do it? Risk everything for someone you barely know. Jesse sighed, his gaze drifting to the stars that were beginning to pepper the inky sky. I saw something in your eyes, Kiera, a spark of defiance, and I couldn't stand by and watch it be extinguished. He paused, his voice roughened with a memory. I failed to save someone once. I won't make that mistake again. He didn't elaborate, and Kiera didn't press him. She sensed a deep well of pain beneath his stoic exterior, a wound he kept carefully guarded. Instead, she offered him a story of her own, of her dreams of owning a small patch of land, of growing wildflowers instead of enduring another loveless day in that town. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Jesse taught Kiera how to track animals, how to identify edible plants, how to shoot a rifle with surprising accuracy. He showed her how to read the land, how to anticipate changes in the weather, how to survive in a world that could be both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. Keep your eyes open, he instructed one morning, as they rode through a canyon carved by ancient floods. The plains speak, Kiera. You just have to learn to listen. Kiera absorbed his lessons like a parched plant drinking rain. With each skill she mastered, a new layer of confidence bloomed within her. She started to anticipate his instructions, to notice the subtle signs of danger or opportunity. The awkward silences lessened, replaced by comfortable companionship and shared laughter. She found herself looking forward to his stories, his quiet observations, the unexpected glimpses of warmth that flickered in his eyes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Jesse pulled out a harmonica. The notes he played were mournful, haunting melodies that seemed to echo the vastness of the plains. Kiera listened, mesmerized, the music weaving a spell around them. When he finished, the silence was thick with unspoken emotions. My father taught me that, Jesse said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. He was a good man. He would be proud of you, Kiera whispered, her heart aching for the pain she sensed in him. As the days passed, Kiera realized that their journey was about more than just escaping her past. It was about discovering who she was meant to be and maybe, just maybe, finding a future she could finally embrace. But the plains held dangers beyond the elements, and she knew that the threat of her family finding them loomed large on the horizon. She could feel it in the air, a tightening coil of fear that whispered on the wind. The whistle of freedom. The morning sun dripped gold onto the canyon floor, painting the dust motes dancing in the air inside their makeshift camp. Kiera watched Jesse tend the small fire, his movements economical and quiet. He wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. He'd shared his meager rations, chosen the least comfortable watch, and treated her with a respect she'd rarely known, even from her own family. She noticed the way he kept glancing at a piece of wood he'd pulled from his saddlebag the night before. It was a smooth, pale piece of cottonwood, no bigger than her hand. Curiosity finally got the better of her. "What's it you've got there?" she asked, tilting her head. Jesse looked up, startled. He'd been so lost in thought, he hadn't realized she was awake. A faint blush crept up his neck. "Just whittling." He held out the wood. It was starting to take shape. She could see the faint outline of wings, the curve of a neck. "You're making a bird," she breathed, surprised. She'd never pegged Jesse as the artistic type. He seemed so practical, so focused on survival. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the carving. "Something to do with my hands. Keeps the quiet away." He picked up a small, worn knife and carefully shaved off a sliver of wood. The scent of cedar filled the air, a clean, sharp fragrance that momentarily masked the ever-present dust and sage. Kiera watched him work, mesmerized. His hands, calloused and strong from years of riding and roping, moved with surprising delicacy. He seemed to pour all his focus into the task, his brow furrowed in concentration. Hours later, as the sun climbed higher, Jesse held out the finished product. It was a small, graceful bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. The detail was remarkable. He'd even managed to capture the delicate curve of its beak and the texture of its feathers. "For you," he said, his voice gruff. "A reminder that you're not caged." Kiera took the bird, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. It was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she'd ever owned. Tears welled in her eyes. "Thank you, Jessie," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It's perfect." She clutched the bird to her chest, a tangible symbol of the freedom she craved, the freedom he was helping her find. Meanwhile, back at the Esperanza Ranch, Javier was in a blind rage. He stormed through the house, overturning furniture and bellowing obscenities. The livestock had arrived that morning, fat and healthy, but the sight of them only fueled his fury. He had been publicly humiliated. He found Kiera's mother huddled in a corner, sobbing. He grabbed her roughly by the arm. "Where is she?" he roared, his face contorted with anger. Where did she go? Her mother, terrified, could only point a trembling finger towards the horizon. Javier's eyes narrowed. He knew who was responsible. That blasted cowboy, Callahan. He'd heard whispers about him, stories of a man haunted by his past, a man who lived by his own code. "He'll pay for this," Javier snarled, his voice low and menacing. "They both will." He stormed out of the house and into the stables. He barked orders at his ranch hands, his voice cracking with fury. Within minutes, a posse was assembled, armed and ready to ride. Javier mounted his horse, his eyes burning with a cold, calculating hatred. He raised his hand, a signal to move out. "Find them," he commanded, his voice echoing across the ranch yard. "Bring them back to me, and make sure Callahan doesn't survive the encounter." He spurred his horse forward, leading the posse into the vast, unforgiving landscape. The hunt had begun, and Javier would stop at nothing to reclaim his pride and exact his revenge. The air hung thick with the promise of violence, the distant howl of a coyote the only sound accompanying their grim pursuit. Whispers of the land. The storm, a snarling beast only hours before, had retreated, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and aching with cold. Kiera shivered, pulling her threadbare shawl tighter. Jesse, ever watchful, scanned the horizon, his hand resting on the rifle across his saddle. They needed shelter, and soon. "Smoke," Jesse said, his voice low, pointing to a thin, gray ribbon rising in the distance. "Could be trouble, but it's our best bet." Kiera swallowed her apprehension. Every encounter since leaving her father's ranch had been fraught with danger. But the gnawing emptiness in her stomach and the biting wind urged her forward. They rode for another hour, the landscape gradually transforming from windswept plains to a sheltered valley carved deep into the earth. Rounding a bend, they saw it, a small encampment nestled beside a clear, fast-flowing stream. Teepees, made of tan hides, stood like silent sentinels against the backdrop of towering cottonwood trees. Women were scraping hides, children played with bone toys, and men sharpened spears, their faces etched with a quiet dignity. It was a Native American settlement, unlike any Kiera had ever seen. Jesse raised his hand in a gesture of peace, dismounting slowly. Kiera followed, her heart pounding against her ribs. They were immediately surrounded, but no weapons were drawn. Instead, dark assessing eyes met theirs. A man, taller than the rest, with a face lined with wisdom and a single eagle feather braided into his hair, stepped forward. He spoke in a language Kiera didn't understand, but Jesse replied in kind, a series of guttural sounds and gestures. After a tense exchange, the man nodded, and a woman offered them water in a gourd dipper. The water was cool and sweet, a balm to Kiera's parched throat. They were led to a small fire, where a stew bubbled in a clay pot. The aroma was intoxicating. That night, huddled around the fire, bellies full of the savory stew, Kiera and Jesse learned they were among the Lakota people. The chief, whose name Jesse translated as Wise Owl, listened patiently as Jesse explained their plight, his expression unreadable. The Lakota offered them shelter for a few days, a reprieve from their relentless flight. Kiera spent her time observing the women, learning to weave baskets from reeds and to identify edible plants. She felt a connection to the land she'd never experienced before, a sense of belonging she hadn't known she craved. One afternoon, Wise Owl beckoned her to sit beside him. He pointed to the surrounding landscape. "The land speaks, little sister," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You must learn to listen." He showed her how to find water beneath the parched earth, how to predict the weather by observing the behavior of animals, how to use the stars to navigate. He spoke of the spirits that inhabited the trees and the rocks, the sacredness of all living things. Kiera listened, fascinated. She felt a stirring within her, a sense of awakening. The land wasn't just a backdrop to her life. It was a living, breathing entity, full of secrets and wisdom. She felt the earth beneath her bare feet, cool and grounding. She inhaled the scent of pine and damp earth, a fragrance that filled her with a strange sense of peace. That night, lying beside Jesse under a canopy of stars, Kiera felt a shift within herself. She was no longer just running away. She was running towards something, a deeper understanding of herself and her place in the world. I think I'm learning things here, Jesse," she whispered. "Things I never knew I needed to know." Jesse turned to her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "This land, it changes people, Kiera. It shows them who they truly are." He paused, a flicker of pain in his eyes. "Sometimes, that's not always a good thing." Kiera reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "We'll face it together," she said, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. The journey ahead would be long and dangerous, but she was no longer just a girl running from a forced marriage. She was becoming something more, something stronger, forged in the crucible of the wilderness and guided by the whispers of the land. Canyon chase. The sun, a molten coin in the vast sky, beat down on Kiera's neck. She squinted, shielding her eyes with a gloved hand. "Jesse," she breathed, her voice tight. "Look." He followed her gaze. In the distance, dust devils danced on the horizon, but beneath them, a dark line was forming, snaking across the parched earth. The glint of sunlight on metal, the unmistakable silhouette of riders. "The posse," Jesse confirmed, his jaw hardening. He wheeled his horse, Buck, around. "We need to move. Now." Kiera didn't hesitate. She spurred her mare, Dulcinea, forward, the animal responding instantly, her hooves drumming a frantic rhythm against the hard-packed ground. The open plains gave way abruptly to a jagged maw in the earth, the canyon. Their only hope now was to descend into its depths, to lose themselves amongst the shadows and the treacherous terrain. The descent was perilous. Loose screes slid beneath Dulcinea's hooves, and Kiera gripped the reins tightly, her knuckles white. Jesse, riding close behind, called out, "Easy now, steady. Let her find her footing." The air grew cooler as they plunged deeper, the canyon walls rising on either side, painted in hues of ochre and rust. The scent of dry earth and sun-baked rock filled Kiera's nostrils. She could hear the rasp of Jesse's breathing, the snorts of the horses, each sound amplified in the narrow space. "Think we lost them?" Kiera asked, her voice echoing slightly. Jesse glanced back up at the canyon rim, a grim line etched around his mouth. "Not yet. They'll be down here soon enough." He pointed to a narrow ledge that clung to the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a horse. "We'll take that. It's a shortcut, but tricky." Kiera swallowed hard. The ledge looked impossibly narrow, the drop sheer and unforgiving. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her courage. But she looked at Jesse, his gaze steady and resolute, and found a flicker of her own resolve. "All right," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Jesse led the way, Buck picking his way carefully along the ledge. Kiera followed, her heart hammering in her chest. Dulcinea whinnied nervously, her muscles trembling. Kiera leaned forward, whispering reassurances, stroking the mare's neck. A rock dislodged beneath Dulcinea's hoof, tumbling into the abyss. Kiera gasped, clutching at the reins. The mare stumbled, nearly losing her balance. "Kiera!" Jesse shouted, reaching out a hand. For a heart-stopping moment, Kiera thought she was going to fall. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. But then she felt Jesse's strong hand grip hers, pulling her back, steadying her. Dulcinea, recovering her footing, stood trembling. "You okay?" Jesse asked, his voice tight with concern. Kiera nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, suspended between the canyon wall and the void, their shared fear and reliance forged a connection deeper than words. They continued along the ledge, the silence broken only by the clatter of hooves and the rush of wind. As they rounded a bend, they saw it, a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, hidden from view unless you knew where to look. "This is it," Jesse said, guiding Buck towards the opening. "We can use this to get above them." Kiera followed him into the crevice. It was dark and cramped, the air thick with the smell of dust and damp earth. They dismounted, leading the horses behind them. The crevice wound upwards, a natural staircase carved into the rock. As they climbed, Kiera could hear the distant sound of the posse, their voices echoing in the canyon below. They were getting closer. "We're almost there," Jesse said, his voice low. "Just a little further." Kiera pressed on, her muscles aching, her lungs burning. She didn't know what awaited them at the top, but she knew they had to keep moving. They had to keep running. Storm and shelter. The first fat plops hit Kiera's face, a blessed coolness after the sun's brutal assault. She'd been humming a little tune, finding contentment in the creaking saddle and her mare's even stride, but Jesse's touch on her arm pulled her up short. He gestured towards the darkening heavens, a canvas of bruised purple rapidly devouring the last light. "Trouble's brewing," he rumbled, his gaze sweeping the horizon, voice a low warning. Minutes later, the wind howled around them, peppering their skin with dust and stinging grit. A jagged finger of lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating the desolate expanse. The horses, unnerved, stamped and snorted, their ears pinned back. Jesse urged them onward, his jaw set with grim resolve. "There's a dilapidated shelter marked on my map, a couple of miles west," he yelled over the gathering gale. "We need to reach it before this breaks loose." They pushed their mounts onward, the wind tearing at their garments, the rain escalating to a punishing deluge. Kiera gripped the reins, a cold dread twisting in her gut. She'd weathered storms before, but this one felt different, antagonistic. Jesse rode close, a comforting anchor against the escalating fury, his hand occasionally reaching to steady her. Finally, through the curtain of rain, she spotted it, a ramshackle cabin, its weathered planks faded to a mournful gray. It seemed deserted, forgotten by time, but it promised refuge. Jesse shoved the warped door inward, and they practically dragged their horses into the dim interior, grateful for any shield from the elements. The cabin was a simple room, scantily furnished with a wobbly table and a couple of upturned stools. A thick layer of dust coated everything, and cobwebs hung like spectral draperies in the corners. But it was dry at least. Jesse quickly secured the horses in a crude lean-to against the back wall, then returned, shaking the water from his brim. "Not exactly the Ritz," he commented, a hint of amusement tugging at his lips, "but it'll keep the worst of it off us." Kiera managed a faint smile. She was drenched and shivering, yet the relief of escaping the storm's clutches was immense. She settled into a relatively clean patch of floor, drawing her knees to her chest. Jesse coaxed a flame to life in the small hearth, orange tendrils hungrily consuming the dry wood, painting the walls with flickering shadows. The warmth began to permeate her chilled limbs, slowly driving away the cold. As the fire snapped and popped, they sat in silence, listening to the tempest roar outside. The wind shrieked like a tormented spirit, and the rain hammered the roof in a relentless tattoo. After a time, Jesse's voice broke the stillness, soft and deliberate. "Tell me something, Kiera. Anything at all." She hesitated, then, drawn by the fire's heat and Jesse's reassuring presence, she began to confide. She spoke of her longings to escape the ranch, to see the ocean's vastness, to become an educator. She confessed the burden of her family's expectations, the isolation that clung to her, even amidst a crowd. Jesse listened intently, his eyes never wavering from her face. When she had finished, he offered no empty reassurances or facile dismissals. He simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of her feelings. Then he opened up about his history, the war, the comrades he'd lost, the lingering darkness that haunted him. He spoke of his yearning for redemption, to channel his abilities to aid those without recourse. Sharing their vulnerabilities in the dancing firelight created a bond that transcended mere appreciation or infatuation. It was a shared understanding, a mutual exposure of their deepest selves that dissolved the barriers they had unconsciously erected. The storm raged on unabated, but inside the cabin, a sense of tranquility descended. Kiera felt herself drawn to Jesse, to his understated strength and his compassionate nature. She reached for his hand, her fingers weaving between his. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch held a surprising tenderness. He met her gaze, his eyes brimming with an unreadable depth. He gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "Kiera," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. The kiss was tentative at first, a soft exploration. But as their lips met, a spark flared to life, a fierce, undeniable yearning that echoed the storm outside. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more consuming. It was a kiss fueled by fear, by gratitude, by shared vulnerability, and by a longing they could no longer deny. A father's change. Whirlwinds skittered across the sun-scorched earth as they topped the rise, overlooking perdition. A meager collection of adobe structures clinging to the banks of the Rio Grande. Jesse halted blue, a frown creasing his brow. This feels wrong. Behind him, Kiera's stomach clenched. Perdition was meant to be their refuge, a place to vanish among wanderers and outlaws. Instead, the air thrummed with menace. The reason became starkly apparent as they entered the town. A dozen of Javier's men sprawled before the saloon, their expressions like granite. Recognition flared in their eyes as they spotted Kiera. "Looks like your father anticipated our arrival," Jesse murmured, his hand drifting towards his Colt. "He wouldn't," Kiera breathed, but the denial felt hollow. She knew her father's pride, his unwavering stubbornness. Jesse dismounted, assisting her to the ground. "Stay close." Before they'd gone 3 paces, Javier emerged from the saloon, his gaze ablaze. "Kiera, Esperanza, you dishonor me." The gathering crowd parted, leaving Kiera exposed under her father's burning glare. In his face, she saw the sting of disappointment mingled with a furious resolve. A shard of primal fear pierced her defiance. "Papa, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Just hear me out." "Hear you? You eloped with this drifter." Javier spat, waving a dismissive hand at Jesse. "You've shamed our name." Jesse stood firm, his eyes unflinching. "She's a woman, not some chattel to be bartered." "Silence!" Javier roared, reaching for the rifle at his shoulder. "This is between my blood and me." Kiera stepped forward, interposing herself between Jesse and her father. "No, Papa. It concerns me above all." She met his gaze, searching for a trace of the man who had spun tales beneath the desert stars. "I'm not a possession to be traded for livestock," she declared, her voice gaining conviction. "I am a woman with desires of my own. I choose my path." Javier's features hardened. "And you choose him? A man with nothing, a fugitive running from his own demons." Kiera turned to Jesse, her fingers seeking his. His rough hand closed over hers, a silent promise of support. "I choose a man who truly sees me, Papa. A man who respects me, who values my spirit, a man who loves me." The ensuing silence was thick and heavy. Javier stared at their joined hands, his face a battleground of emotions. Kiera detected something unexpected beneath the fury, a glimmer of understanding. He looked from Kiera to Jesse, his gaze lingering on the raw emotion in their eyes, witnessing the love that blossomed despite the danger, despite his disapproval. He saw the indomitable spirit he himself had nurtured. At last, Javier sighed. The sound weighted with resignation. "Enough," he said, his voice drained of its earlier vehemence. He addressed his men. "Stand down." Hesitation rippled through the posse. Javier leveled a withering look at them. "I said stand down. This isn't worth spilling blood over." He turned back to Kiera, his eyes filled with profound sorrow. "Go," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Find your happiness. But know this, you're no longer welcome within these walls." A tear traced a path down Kiera's cheek. A bittersweet triumph, freedom purchased at the cost of her family. But as she gazed at Jesse, his eyes reflecting love and devotion, she knew she'd made the right choice. "Thank you, Papa," she murmured. Javier simply nodded, turning to retreat into the saloon. His men, their faces etched with bewilderment, followed. Jesse squeezed Kiera's hand. "Let's leave this behind." They mounted Blue, and as they rode from perdition, Kiera cast a final glance over her shoulder. The border town, representing her past, diminished into the distance. Ahead lay the open trail, a future uncertain, yet brimming with the promise of love and liberty. She looked up at Jesse, his gaze tender and reassuring, and they rode on into the dawn.